Hi, and welcome to That Anthro podcast. I'm your host, Gabriella Campbell, and today, for the first ever episode of the podcast, we have a very special guest. Her name is Amy Anderson, and she's a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara. So I've had the wonderful opportunity to not only have Amy as a teacher, but to also work alongside her as a research assistant. And she is doing some fascinating and groundbreaking research at UCSB. Amy received her BA from UNC in Classics and Archaeology and is currently working on her PhD at UCSB in Integrated Anthropological Sciences, where she is conducting research on disease ecology, paleopathology, and the impact of disease and nutrition on skeletal tissues in both living and past populations. Today, she is going to talk to us about her research, her work with the Chumani Health and Life History Project, as well as some of her own fieldwork experiences. I think this is going to be a great episode, and I hope you enjoy. So without further ado, please welcome Amy Anderson. Hi, Amy. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, I'm so stoked to be here.
So when I met you back in January of 2019 as my osteology teacher, one of the first questions that I had to ask you was about field schools, and I really wanted your opinion on experiences and field work, and you were actually very helpful in preparing me for the one that I attended this past summer in Spain. So to start off the episode, I want to talk to you about some of your undergraduate fieldwork experiences, specifically in Ostopolia, Greece. Would you like to tell us maybe a little bit about that site, and then we can get into the more details?
Sure, yeah. So Ostopolia is kind of an amazingly unique opportunity for students who are involved in osteology because it's an infant cemetery. And last I checked, it was the largest known infant cemetery in the archaeological world.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the excavations there are run by University College London, and Simon Hilson and Anna Clement were the co-directors when I was there. So the cemetery itself is on the hillside of this small island in the Dodecanese. It's the smallest inhabited island there. It's gorgeous Mediterranean vista. Everything's a postcard. But the cemetery is on a hillside, and all of the children are buried in amphorae. So these are reused vessels that would have been storage vessels for olive oil or wine being shipped different places. So the site's quite interesting because as the osteologists there, you're not excavating on the hillside, you're doing micro excavations of these burial containers that have filled with sediment and have tiny infant skeletons in them. So you're in a lab setting, excavating with dental tools, quite small, fragile remains.
Were all of these remains under 1 year old, or is there a certain age parameter that defined what you were excavating?
So when I was there, I think the oldest individual that they had found was around 2.5. But most of them are neonates, just newborns and preemies. Yeah, definitely in the infant range.
And how is it different in your other experiences excavating adult and juvenile remains? What are the biggest challenges or differences?
Well, one, it was definitely cushier because we were excavating inside.
That's a rarity.
Yeah, in a lab on the top of a hill with like a Mediterranean breeze and a view of the ocean. It was kind of unreal. So as physical labor, it was a lot easier than other excavation situations, which are usually pretty challenging physically. It was also, I think, the emotional impact of excavating infants is quite different because the context of their death is sort of more immediately clear, and the emotions of the people who would have been grieving their death seem more accessible. Although, of course, that's it's all all your own imagination. But there's sort of like a very like poignant sadness to you know, holding bones that are just so tiny. But it's also really important to learn, because infant skeletons look pretty drastically different from adult skeletons, and in excavation contexts where people aren't specifically trained to identify them, they often get misidentified as animal remains, as faunal remains. And of course, for anyone who's interested in forensic work, juveniles end up in the forensic record upsettingly often. And so being able to identify them and to estimate age precisely is really crucial to finding missing individuals. So I wouldn't say that I enjoyed it more than excavating adults, but it was a really formative learning experience in my osteological training, and I feel really fortunate to have gotten the opportunity to work at that site. And I believe they're still ongoing, that field school.
Yes, they are. It still is an ongoing field school. So if anyone's interested, it's Ostopalia, Greece. And what are some of your fieldwork must-haves? The number one for me that you recommended was dissolvable electrolyte powder, and that was a lifesaver.
Yeah, I've gotten heat stroke more times than I'm really comfortable admitting. Yeah. So learned that lesson a little too late. But fieldwork must-haves. You know, after about like 5 weeks, I think, and depends how long your field season is, but homesickness sets in, and no matter where you are and what food you're eating and how good the local food is, like everyone has their home comfort foods. And I know for a lot of the people I've been in excavation situations with, it's like burritos, Mexican food, everyone's really craving it. But my family's from South Africa, so our like home comfort food is curry. So I always pack curry powder.
Well, that's easy to transport.
Yeah, exactly. So like, just in case I get the opportunity to cook some of my own food, because you never know what the setup is going to be for, you know, group dining, etc., with the field crew. But I like to pack like a range of spices so that I can, I don't know, I really like
spice up any dish.
Yeah, you know, like add some comfort or some versatility or diversity to the flavor palettes in front of you, because food, you can get very food focused in the field, especially if it's like physically difficult environment or socially difficult, because I'm quite an introvert, and field situations are usually like very intense with the social interaction. So having your creature comforts is quite important to like maintaining your general sanity out in the field. So I also love to pack like a little spa treatment, you know, face masks or whatever, so I can like lock myself away for at least one afternoon and like feel a little bit more human.
I'm gonna take that advice for next time.
Yeah, my skin suffers every time I go into the field, whether it's, you know, dry and dusty or hot and humid or whatever it is, and I just feel like a gremlin after a couple of weeks. So being able to reset is really important.
That's great. And what is your favorite location so far been to do field work in?
I mean, Ostopalia was really cush. It was gorgeous. But my first field experience was in Eastern Crete. Yeah, we're excavating a cemetery associated with a Minoan palace. And so that was, I was quite starstruck by all of that. It was glorious. But the landscape there really affected me, really got to my heart, because it's that sort of, I guess we have it in Santa Barbara too. I think it's possibly part of the reason I ended up coming here, but it has that, you know, Mediterranean, rugged mountain feel that really reminded me of South Africa, and so it really got under my skin and into my heart, and I would love to have an excuse to go back there, even as a tourist sometime, but it hasn't happened yet.
Such a rich archaeological history on that island.
Oh yeah, you're
And
stepping
Greece
on
in general.
ceramics every couple of steps. You know,
Oh,
it's just
wow.
it's everywhere you walk. Yeah.
Well, moving on, since you've started your PhD at UCSB, you've become really involved in using data from the Chumani Health and Life History Project, which for some of our viewers, listeners that may not know, it's one of the largest ongoing research projects at UCSB in tandem with other universities. And the Chumani are an indigenous foraging population in Bolivia, and the Chumani Health and Life History Project spans many areas of research, including ecology, biodemography, and anthropological research, as well as providing medical care to the Chumani people. So, what sort of data have you been using from this project for your research?
Okay. This is such a rich data set, and such a again a fantastic opportunity. I've been so lucky to be involved with the projects that I've tapped into. So I've been focusing on computed tomography data, so CT scans, CAT scans, of older Chumani that were obtained as part of a study spearheaded by my advisor, Dr. Michael Gervin, that was looking at aging in a subsistence population, specifically looking at Alzheimer's and dementia risk, and also cardiovascular disease. Just sort of tease it out a bit whether those things are inescapable parts of human biology of aging, or whether there's a significant lifestyle component to them that we can tease out by looking at people who are living non-industrialized lifestyles. And so there are all these existing scans. And one thing I try to do a lot with my work is to get the most out of data that already exist, because data like that are really there's a lot of investment to create those data, and so I think there's sort of a scientific ethical responsibility to get the most out of what we have before we go get more, you know.
I agree, and that's what's so cool about the Chumani project, is that it does span so many different topics and areas of study, and the amount of research that's been produced from it is insane.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it's a longitudinal study and that it's been going for as long as it has is such a that's a really incredible opportunity. And
how many years has it been going? I don't recall seeing in my research.
I'm gonna get this wrong. I think it's 17. It might be 18 by now. But they're coming up on 20 years. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And so I've been looking at the heads. They have head scans and chest scans, and I'm focusing primarily on the cranial scans, because I'm really interested in skeletal indicators of disease processes that we can see in the cranial vault and the orbital roofs. And so those are things that are typically looked at in archaeological contexts and don't get a lot of attention in clinical contexts, and are typically seen as being absent in extant populations and living people. And I think that they may be overlooked instead. And the only way to really understand what they mean for individual health for people who lived with them is to look at the health of people who currently are living with them, right? When you can get a sense of how they are feeling, and what they're able to do day to day, and see what kind of functional cost there is, what kind of diseases these things are associated with down the line. So I'm really only able to do that because there's all this longitudinal health data with the project. So we have biomarkers from blood. We have anthropometrics, so I can look at stature as a proxy for growth and health in the developmental period. And We have sort of self-reported health scores from individuals. You know, how are you feeling? How do you feel about your own health? And yeah, it's I keep finding new aspects of the data from the project that makes sense to integrate into my project, which I'm gonna have to circumscribe at some point so I can get a PhD.
Yeah, the list is getting long.
It's true. Yeah, but especially with COVID happening right now and that delaying research plans and things, I think there's a lot of room for flexibility in what becomes part of the dissertation and what is just part of a larger program of research that I continue afterwards, because I hope to continue working with the Chumani project in different avenues.
Yeah. And you actually have plans to travel to Bolivia to work there, should travel conditions allow. Tell us about that. Why are you going, and how long do you plan to stay?
Right. Okay. So there is a project that John Stieglitz, who's at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, and Brigitte Holt at UMass Amherst are leading, and they're looking at bone density over the life course, and also cross-sectional geometry of long bones, so sort of the shape of, you know, the tibias and femurs and things of individuals of all ages and both sexes in the population, because most of the studies on osteoporosis and on the protective effects of physical activity on, you know, mitigating osteoporosis risk have taken place, you know, with athletes in industrialized contexts. And so there's a lot of room for investigating how that plays out in a non-industrialized subsistence population, and how physical activity at younger ages impacts risk for bone density loss and you know, bone fracture at later ages. And so they were able to get a big chunk of funding to get a peripheral quantitative computed tomography machine, so PQCT, that takes just a single slice. So instead of like a full head scan, which is like, you know, 250 slices stacked up together, it's just one slice. So you get a cross section. And so that's incredibly minimal radiation exposure. And so we're able to scan children as well as adults, which we can't do with the other scans because it's, you know, we got to pass
too much exposure to radiation.
Yeah. And so the idea there is that we're going to scan a cross section of the population and connect it to behavioral data. So they've already been collecting data on a sample of individuals who have been wearing respirometers and activity monitors. So we have a sense of their physical activity levels and you know, what they're doing with their time, and sampling across the dry season and the wet season. And so we'll be able to connect some of that data to what we see in the appearance of the bone itself. And so the data collection for that, I'll be the one down there actually running the PQCT machine and collecting the scans. And we estimate that once we get down there, it should take about 6 months to scan the sample that we want. We're aiming for a little over 700 people. And we have to bring them all into the town, to the clinic where we'll have the machine. And so we'll be transporting people from individual villages. They're sort of dispersed villages along the Maniqui River in lowland Bolivia and the Amazon. And so there are some logistical difficulties with transportation. Especially during the wet season.
That project sounds fascinating.
It should be really cool. And yeah, there are, again, a lot of possibilities there to connect, biomarkers of bone turnover with, physical activity and bone phenotype. And biomarkers of bone turnovers is one chunk of my dissertation project that I hopefully will be able to get to whenever lab work is allowed to resume.
Yeah, hopefully that'll be soon, so that you can get moving forward on this project. I can't wait to hear about it and hear more about the results and everything.
Thanks.
Maybe let's transition into discussing your dissertation. Something for our audience to hear is Amy describes her research as triangulating data from medical data, translational research, and archaeological sites in both living and ancient populations. So how has using this data allowed you to answer your research questions in new ways?
Thank you for that question. Okay. So my background is in bioarchaeology, and I'm specifically interested in the skeletal biology of disease, how health impacts the skeleton. But archaeologists, when they talk about health, they're looking at the bones 99% of the time. That's all they've got to ascertain health from. And so the baseline for what we can determine about health from the skeleton often comes from the medical clinical literature, but there's not a ton of incentive for physicians to document like all of the skeletal correlates of disease, because they're not the most sensitive or informative diagnostic indicators for, determining what is giving someone pain and how to help them feel better. So it makes perfect sense that information just typically isn't out there in the literature. But I think because it's not there, archaeologists are quite limited in what we can say about, health, what we can infer about health from the skeleton. And so I think, especially with advances in medical imaging technology that have happened in the last decade or so, with CT scans and the incredible resolution that you can get on these things now, there's a new opportunity.
Without it being invasive.
Exactly. Less invasive, not destructive to archaeological remains as well. And it gives you sort of a comparable platform, right? You can look at a CT scan of archaeological remains and CT scan of a living individual, and there's some things that you can't compare absolutely directly, like bone mineral density, for various reasons I won't get into. But you can really get a sense of like skeletal shape and the distribution of bone, and you can compare those things pretty directly. And so there's a lot of space, I think, that's newly created to really investigate how health is connected to, how our lived experience builds a skeletal phenotype in terms of, pathological experiences. And so that's the space that I really want to inhabit, so we can get better at inferring health in past populations, and also just have an integrated approach to the skeletal biology and health through time, because the skeletal record is sort of a continuous line of data, from then to now. Everyone's got a skeleton, and we can I think it would be just so cool to be able to get more information, right? The dead can tell tales, but we have to know how to read their books.
And also just the concept of integrated lines of evidence and different, you cross into biology and chemistry quite a bit. I think it's really important in science today that we communicate across these false boundaries of, oh, you're an anthropologist, or oh, you're a biologist, or you're a bioarchaeologist. It's really important to kind of connect that data and see what you can infer from all the lines of evidence.
Yeah, my approach has generally been that you find the question that you're interested in, and then you figure out what skills you need and where you need to go in order to answer that question. And, whatever those are, that's what's on your to-do list.
And then you just pursue it.
Yeah, exactly. You can worry about how to brand yourself or market yourself later, I guess.
Yeah. Should we talk a bit about what are porous cranial lesions and how they're formed?
Sure, yeah. So
Criba orbitalia and parodic hyperostosis, for those who may not be familiar.
Yes, they gave them these big, Criba orbitalia in the Latin and parodic hyperostosis in the Greek. So, not being consistent with their chosen terminology there in the grand tradition of anatomical terminology.
Yes.
Yeah. So these are. The definition has sort of drifted through time, but now I think the preferred terminology is shifting to just saying porous cranial lesions, which is a descriptive term that's trying to be as straightforward as possible. So these are, this is sort of a pathological appearance of bone where you look at it and you go, oh, that's not normal. And it shows up on the cranial vault, so sort of the top of the skull, and then also in the top of the eye sockets, the orbital roofs. And it's really just describing bone that looks kind of spongy or porous or sieve-like, pitted. And so...
that bone is being resorbed due to a processes which you are investigating, such as anemia.
Yeah, so bone surface can look porous because the bone is being resorbed or because it's new bone that's being laid down. And historically, most of these lesions have been attributed to anemia. But I think we don't really know what the biological pathways are to that skeletal formation. So when you can tell that the porous lesions themselves are due to expansion of the bone marrow space and resorption of the bone directly on top of that marrow space, the idea is that it's due to anemia and an expansion of the red blood cell producing marrow at the expense of the bone that's right next to it. But part of what I'm interested in is trying to discern more directly what exactly is causing it, whether it tends to be anemia or whether it tends to be infection, and if it's anemia, is it anemia of inflammation? Is it dietary iron deficiency? Is it parasitic infection that causes blood loss, like hookworm? And so I'm going to try to get at some of that. Sorry, I feel like I should have a pithier way of explaining all of this by now because it's been a couple of years.
It's okay. It's a complex subject. And that's why research like you're doing is important, because it provides more insights into what's going on. And one day there will be an exact definition.
Yeah, I think I'm right at that point in the PhD pipeline where I'm just so close to it that if you ask me to talk about it, it just expands into like total word vomit. Because I haven't, I don't have my results. I haven't like written up the full dissertation and turned it into a polished job talk just yet, but check back in a couple of years.
Yeah, I'm sure big things are coming, and one of those is an article that you're currently working on about Criba findings from CT scans of contemporary New Mexican children. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is, I guess, another example of finding existing data and, approaching a question from as many angles as possible. So this is a collaborative project that's being led by Lexi O'Donnell, who got her PhD from University of New Mexico. And so this is a collection that's about to be opened and available to all researchers who make data requests. And it's full body digital autopsies, so full body high resolution CT scans of individuals from the New Mexico Office of the Medical Investigator. So, of course, when you have adults, that's all individuals who died under suspicious circumstances, and that hence the autopsies. But with the children, pretty much all children, all child deaths in the state are considered, suspicious. And so the children are quite a representative mortality sample of, all the children who die in the state. So it's, again, quite an emotionally difficult data set to work with, especially because these are not dry bones. You can really see all the soft tissue indicators of trauma and disease on these individuals. But they're all de-identified scans, so the anonymity of the individuals is protected. I did not do the direct data collection. I was more theoretical involvement in this project. But so we collected data from the CT scans looking at porous cranial lesions in this sample of contemporary children, mortality sample, so not living individuals, but still contemporary, which is unusual. And the baseline hypothesis, right, is that we won't find it because it doesn't really exist in modern populations. Mm-hmm. But we did end up finding orbital roof lesions in about 20% of the sample, and cranial vault lesions in about 12%. It's particularly high.
How large was the sample?
So we had 451 observable scans that were, complete and worked for our purposes.
Wow, 20% of that. Is a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. And because it's a contemporary mortality sample, we know cause of death. And so the first thing we were interested in doing was seeing whether there's any correlation between cause of death and porous cranial lesions, which of course is not like a direct, correlation, therefore causation. But first of all, we were able to say, okay, individuals who died of natural causes compared to individuals who died of violent or accidental causes, what does the frequency of lesions look like in those groups? Because these lesions are supposed to be an indicator of, of frailty, of physiological stress. And proof of concept, we did find that there's statistically significantly more common in individuals who die natural deaths. So that was a nice thing to check off. And then moving on to that, it was nice to get that. And then looking at specific causes of death, we found a significant association between both orbital and vault lesions and respiratory infections, active respiratory infections at time of death. So
could that be related to reduced immune response?
It could, right? We can now say that, at least in this context, they're sort of indicators of risk of respiratory infection. And so whether it's the respiratory infection, some process going on as a result of respiratory infection that causes the lesions, or whether it's a prior experience that causes the lesions but also heightens subsequent risk for respiratory infection, it's hard to say, and it's quite likely both, depending on the context. And so we did some work thinking about pathways from, anemia and oxygen deprivation and inflammation and white blood cell proliferation. And but I think the interesting thing there is proof of concept, finding it in a contemporary population, finding the association with risk for respiratory infection. And I think that also guides directions for future research on these lesions in contemporary populations, right? We'd probably expect to find them in populations in higher frequency among populations who experience high incidence of childhood respiratory infection. Just resubmitted that article, and so
yeah, I can't wait to read it, hopefully.
Like post revisions. Thanks. The next thing is looking at sex differences, because usually, as you know, in archaeological contexts, you can't distinguish
in the entire
males and females until
yeah.
post-puberty. Right, so you can go for the adults, but the children are just sort of, they're all children. We don't know boys, we don't know girls, they're just children. But with this, we have indicators of biological sex, and we're able to look at childhood differences in the frequency of lesions, the severity of lesions, the association between lesions and mortality risk. And so I think we're getting some interesting patterns out of that, but the manuscript's not that far along, so I don't want to give any spoilers.
That's totally fine, we understand. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast today. For those of you interested, I will have Amy's webpage and her most recent article linked below in the description, so check that out. And great.